Okay, so Torrin, I'm going to read today from Luke's Gospel, chapter 5, and starting with verse 33. And what I'm thinking about as I begin to read this is here we are, first time together in a new year, and of course, you know, when the calendar page turns over and it's a new year, we're naturally thinking about new things, and you know, people make New Year's resolutions, and it's a time when people think about new beginnings and new starts and new ideas, new things. And that's natural, you know, for us to do that, and there's no problem with that. In fact, not a bad thing at all. But sometimes, you see, it's a human thing. Our calendars are artificial, and it's just a way for us to mark time. And though we are conscious of that, we sometimes project that kind of human thinking onto God and imagine that because a calendar page turns over, God's going to do a new thing, or God's going to do something different, or sometimes people say that, what new thing is God going to do, especially at the beginning of a new year? What's God going to do in this year that's different than He did in the previous year? And I'd like to suggest that no, He's not going to do anything different in 2023. But there was a time when He actually did do something different. When, you see, God lives in eternity, you see, and He doesn't have a calendar. And so when the calendar page turns over for us, eternity is still the same. But there was a time, and I want to talk about that. You know, in the Old Testament, in Isaiah and the prophets, Isaiah says, speaking for the Lord, behold, I will do a new thing. And there is that you can read in the prophets. Of course, you have to understand that the Old Testament prophets were primarily looking forward to Jesus. Jesus is the focal point of Old Testament prophecy. He was Jesus coming into the world was the focus of the Old Testament prophets. And that did represent a tremendous change. And you can see that in some of the things that Jesus said. A new era had begun to dawn with the arrival of Jesus. And here's a passage that alludes to that. You see, the Pharisees, and here we read about the disciples of John the Baptist, they seemed to be confused and couldn't really understand. To them, they perceived that Jesus and His disciples represented a change of attitude or a change of thinking. And here they're bringing this up in verse 33. It said, they said unto Him, why do the disciples of John fast often and make prayers, and likewise the disciples of the Pharisees, but thine eat and drink? In other words, they weren't behaving like the disciples of the Pharisees and even the disciples of John the Baptist. They observed them doing something different. And Jesus answers this, and actually He has two answers for it. The first one is this. He said, can you make the children of the bride chamber fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, and then they shall fast in those days. So the first answer is the narrow answer. It's talking about His 12 disciples, and He's saying, hey, you know, I'm here with them. And He calls Himself a bridegroom here. Now, you know, we oftentimes just read right over this and go on, but a bridegroom means there's a marriage. Isn't that right? And when there's a marriage, there's a change. The parties who are involved, the husband and wife, I mean, the parties who are involved in the marriage, everything's going to be different after that. It was one way before, but after the marriage, He calls Himself a bridegroom. After that, everything's different, especially for the bride. He's the bridegroom. The bride, metaphorically, of course, you understand. He's speaking in spiritual metaphors. Metaphorically, the bride is all those who believe in Him, who come into a spiritual union with Him. And in the natural world, when there is a wedding, especially for the bride, there's big changes. She's got a new name. She's got a new place to live. And if the bridegroom is well off, she's got a new wardrobe. Everything's different. A new manner of life, a new way of doing things. And we all know that's true in the physical world. And it's interesting that Jesus makes this comparison. So he's calling himself a bridegroom, and he's saying, hey, when the bridegroom's here, it's party time, like a wedding party. You see, that's what he's saying. And so why do you expect them to behave in a mournful kind of a way? And then he says, I will be parted from them. He said the bridegroom will be taken away from them. And then that'll be a time for them to adopt a kind of a mourning attitude. Now, I think by that, I don't think we should read too much into that. I think he doesn't mean necessarily for us. I think he means them when he was parted from them momentarily at the cross. And they were distraught and fearful. If you read the Gospels, when he was crucified and was parted from them, they locked themselves away and went and hid. But on the day of Pentecost, just a little while later, when the Holy Spirit came at Jesus' promise, he said, I will not leave you alone. I will not leave you as orphans. I will not leave you comfortless. I will come to you, he said, meaning the Holy Spirit. And when the Holy Spirit came, they weren't hiding anymore. They weren't fearful anymore. So what he's talking about here when he says the bridegroom will be taken away from them, that was a short period of time. He doesn't mean to refer to us. But that's the narrow answer. That's the disciples. That's the 12. Then he gives a broader answer that contains a principle or a spiritual truth that explains it in the big picture kind of a way. And here's how he explains the difference. He says in verse 36, he spoke a parable to them, and he said, no man putteth a piece of a new garment upon an old. If otherwise, then both the new maketh a rent, and the piece that was taken out of the new agreeth not with the old. Now, before moving on, I'll just tell you that when I was growing up, and I wore blue jeans as a kid, and kids run around out, get kind of active, and I would get holes in the knees of my blue jeans from crawling around or skidding around, or I don't know what. Now I'm thinking what in the world was I doing to get holes in the knees of the blue jeans, But I would bring them to my mom, and she would, dutifully sew a little patch over that hole. And if anybody's ever tried to do that, that only lasts for a little while, and after a while, the patch and where you join it on, it just makes a bigger hole, is what happens. And that's what Jesus is saying here. You can't take a piece of, let's see, how did he say here? A new garment, a piece of a new garment and sew it onto an old. You just don't do that. So, and then he says, because the new agreeth not with the old. The new doesn't match, in other words. It doesn't fit. Now, keep in mind what the context is. The context is they came along and said, we've noticed that your disciples are not acting like the disciples of the Pharisees and even John the Baptist. They're not fasting and behaving as we expect them to behave. And Jesus' answer for that is, he says, you can't take something new and attach it to something old. That's basically what he's saying. Then he has another example, verse 37. No man putteth new wine into old bottles, else the new wine will burst the bottles and be spilled, and the bottles shall perish. But new wine must be put into new bottles, and both are preserved. Now, it's the same principle, a different analogy. You can't take what's old and then pour it into what's new, or take what's new and pour it into what's old. It won't fit. In fact, here it says it'll burst the bottles. You can't take the new and pour it into what's old. Now, again, the context is, why are your disciples? We detect a difference, is what they were saying. That was their complaint. You and your disciples are not behaving in the old way. And his broader answer is, you can't take new, what he's implying, there's something new. I'm bringing something new, and we can't just pour it into the old forms. He is bringing something new. Then he adds something interesting, verse 39. This is kind of an interesting thought that he tags on to the end. No man having drunk the old wine straightway desireth the new, for he saith the old is better. Now in this he implies that if you're attached to the old, you're going to think that the new is not as good. That's what he's saying. He's kind of pointing a finger back at them and saying, one reason why you're complaining about me and my disciples is you're so full of what's old, you're not ready for what's new. You've been drinking what's old so much. He's implying something new. And if we want to get more specific about it, and I think it's interesting here, it says, no man having drunk the old wine straightway desireth the new. It's interesting that that same thought comes up again at the very end of Jesus' ministry. And for this, I'm going to turn to Matthew's gospel. And then here he makes it explicit what he is hinting at. This is in Matthew's gospel, chapter 26. This is at the Last Supper, chapter 26, verse 26. Matthew chapter 26, verse 26. This is a familiar passage, but look at what he says. Chapter 26, verse 26. As they were eating, and by the way, for them it was just a meal, you know. They were just having a meal together. It was Passover, and they were having the Passover meal. And Jesus, though, saw, or he wanted them to see. Jesus knew already. He knew what was happening. He knew what he was going to. He knew he was bringing something new, but he wants them now to understand it. So, taking the elements of the meal, he makes another comparison or an analogy. As they were eating, in verse 26, Jesus took the bread, and he blessed it, and brake it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take and eat. This is my body." One of the other Gospels, he says, "This is my body broken for you." In other words, he broke the bread, and he said, "This is my body." Now, the bread wasn't literally his body. Symbolically, though, he was saying, my body is about to be broken, and you have a part in it. It's for you. He gave it to them, and he said, eat it. Verse 27, he took the cup, and he gave thanks, and he gave it to them, saying, drink ye all of it. Now, the cup contained wine. And here's what he says in verse 28, for this is my blood of the New Testament. Other translations translate the word testament as covenant. It could be either way. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. And then he adds in verse 29, remember what he said before, having drunk the old wine, nobody wants the new, they think the old is better. Here's what he says about it. But I say to you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Now again, I don't read it, don't think literally. He's speaking spiritually, just like before when he was talking about wine as an illustration of something old and something new. And here he's saying, I'm going to drink the new wine. In other words, I am embracing what's new, and in my Father's kingdom, we'll embrace it together. We'll all be embracing this new thing. And he tells us specifically what's new in verse 28. He said, this is my blood of the New Testament, or New Covenant. Now, a covenant is just an agreement. A covenant is agreement between two parties. That's basically what it is. One party says, I will do this for you, and the other party says, well, I will do this for you. It's an agreement. It's a contract. That's what it is. It's a covenant. And Jesus says, I am, in so many words, I am inaugurating, or I'm initiating, or I am beginning. This is the beginning of a new agreement, a new covenant, a new contract. Now get this. He says, it's not your blood. It's not, in other words, you're not going to shed blood to ratify this covenant. I am. I, Jesus, am going to shed my blood to ratify this covenant. This is my blood to make real or to ratify or to signify this new agreement. But then he gave it to them and said, you drink it. That means I'm going to create this new covenant, but you're going to be the beneficiaries of it. You're going to receive it. And not only is it, you see, in the Old Testament world, in the ancient world, to make a covenant, to make a real binding, they would call it a blood covenant, both parties opened their veins and mingled their blood together. And that was the strongest union or bond that would bind them together. And it signified the fact that I'm making these promises to you and I'm putting my life on the line. I'm swearing my life for the upholding of these promises. Now, Jesus doesn't tell the disciples, now, prick your finger or open up a vein and we're all going to make a covenant together. He says, I'm going to do that. I'm going to shed my blood and create this covenant. Now, this is a really important thing. You see, we don't have a direct covenant with God. In other words, God isn't looking at you and saying, now you make some promises to me and I'll make some promises to you. No, Jesus, on our behalf, as our representative, as a man, as a human being, makes the covenant with God. He opened his veins and shed his blood, and he made the promises. And so it's a covenant between God and Jesus. That's why it's not broken by your own personal failures and mistakes. That's why it stays intact no matter what. That's why it's secure and immutable. But there's another layer of this. That is, and we should ask this question. We're so accustomed to these words and these verses and these ideas, we don't sometimes ask questions that a person might ask if he had never heard it before. First thing you might want to ask is, what's the difference? What's new about it? Well, we already read one thing that was new about it. It's not certain kinds of behaviors define it. But here's something new, right here in verse 28. This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed, and it has this result, for the remission of sins. Now that ought to tell you something. For a Jewish person, like all of them were, sitting around that table, that should have raised a big red flag or a big blinking beacon. They should have said, and no doubt they probably did. They probably pondered that. Nobody seems to have spoken up here. But you see, in the Old Covenant, now see, he's making a new covenant, so there's changes. In the Old Covenant, there's no provision for a human sacrifice. There's an animal sacrifice. Animals shed their blood for the remission of sins. Of course, remission means discharge from the penalty. If you look it up in the dictionary, that's what it means. So this is a radical departure. This is a radical change. Jesus is saying, I will shed my blood, and the result is the remission of sin, the discharge from the penalty from sins. What might have been going through their mind is, well, wait a minute, what about the temple? What about all the animals? What about bringing those animals? The Old Testament specified that those things should be done. It's all written down in Leviticus. It's all specified in great detail about how the animals shed their blood and how everything is sanctified by the blood of these animals and so forth and so on. Now, with that in mind, before we move further, let me just show you something, just to drive the point home. This is in Matthew chapter 5, and this is what we call the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus is introducing some new ideas, and evidently he caught the attention. Torrin, I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 5 and verse, what do I want here? Verse 17. Matthew chapter 5, beginning with verse 17. Evidently, people noticed that Jesus was talking about things in a new way. And in this Sermon on the Mount, he brings that up constantly. He says, now you have heard, for instance, love your neighbors and hate your enemies. But I say to you. In other words, he's saying this is how you understand it, but I'm saying something new. And so people perceived that he was bringing something new, and this evidently he's addressing maybe an accusation against him. He says in verse 17, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets." In other words, I'm not starting a rebellion. I'm not destroying anything. I'm not, using violence or using force. I haven't come to destroy anything, but look at what he does say. "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Now that's an interesting word, isn't it? It's not the same as destroy, but in one way it has the same effect. If you have a loan at the bank, and so you have to make payments on that loan and pay the interest, and you're making your payments, that's a legal contract, isn't it? And so you have to keep going down to the bank every month and making your payments until it's all paid off, then the contract is fulfilled. Isn't that right? No more payments. You didn't go down to the bank and yank it out of the desk drawer and rip it into shreds and destroy it. Janet, did anybody ever do that? No. Yeah. You don't come to destroy the loan, but to fulfill it means you pay it off. Is that right? Yeah. That's what Jesus said. I didn't come to destroy it, but I'm going to fulfill it. And look at this that he adds next, verse 18. "For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle." Now, in case you're wondering, jots and tittles are little tiny marks. In the Hebrew language, they have these little markings that are, there's a name for that, and I can't think of it right now, but they have to do with how it's pronounced and certain things about how it's said and how it's sung, because many times it was chanted by the person in a synagogue service. So these are these little markings, the tiniest little marks are the jots and the tittles. He says, "One jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law." And he didn't put a period. Next there's a comma, and it says till. That means until. That means for a limit. When you say until or till, that means for a period of time. It will not pass until. In other words, here's this period of time, and nothing will change until all be fulfilled. What the implication is, nothing's going to pass. This law is permanent until it's all fulfilled. Now, he just said in the previous verse, "I've come to fulfill." And he says, it's all going to stay intact and whole until all, and there's the word all be fulfilled. You know what that means? Now let me just tell you why I'm spending so much time on that. That means you can't just come along and make little changes. Now Christians sometimes fall into an error of thinking and want to just blend it all together and want to just make one continuous idea, one continuous concept out of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then just kind of merge it all together. You remember what Jesus said about why you can't take a piece of new cloth and sew it onto the old? He says, because they do not agree. By the very fact that Jesus said, "I am going to shed my blood for the remission of sins," he's introducing a new idea. It's a radical, big thing. It's not a little thing either. So sometimes, I've had these conversations with Christians and say, well, we're still under the law, but we just don't offer animals. Now we have the blood of Jesus. Well, you can't just take out what you don't like and put other things in there. Jesus said nothing will change until it's all fulfilled. And if it's all fulfilled, well, what about it? Well, here, let me show you something. This is in Hebrews chapter 8, and the writer here in the Hebrews is making the exact same point. Here's Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. And here's what he says. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. In this chapter, and we're going to look at it in a little more detail in a second, but he's quoting from Jeremiah. And in the prophet Jeremiah, God says, behold. Behold means take a look at this. In our modern vernacular, we would say, hey, come here and look at this. If we want somebody to see, it's calling your attention to see something. See something. I want you to see something. In other words, Jeremiah says, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. And so that's the topic of this chapter. And summing it up, this is the last verse in the chapter, verse 13. Hebrews 8:13, he says, in that he saith a new covenant, by the very fact that he says a new covenant, he has made the first old. Now, in the days of the Old Covenant, they didn't call it the Old Covenant. That was just the Scriptures for them. You know, they didn't consider it old. But he's saying, by the very fact that God comes along through Jeremiah and says, I'm going to make a new covenant, by him saying, I'm going to make a new covenant, that automatically makes the other one old. Now, that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. That's like saying, when something becomes old, it's time to put it away. Now, we know what the word old means, but behind the English words are the Greek words, and the Greek words are a little more expressive. And literally what he said is obsolete. Torrin, would you put up the Amplified Translation for me, and you'll see it here in the Amplified Translation. When God speaks of a new covenant or agreement, he makes the first one obsolete, out of use. That's what the word literally means. No longer in use. Now, I don't know how you could be more specific or plain about it. And what is obsolete, out of use, and annulled because of age is ripe for disappearance and to be dispensed with altogether. That's the argument that the writer to the Hebrews is making. To Hebrews, by the way, that's why it's called Hebrews. He's making this argument to his Jewish readers, which this was I'm sure a real shocking turn of events, a radical new way of looking at things. Torrin, let's try the Message translation. I think it's pretty easy to understand too. By coming up with a new plan, a new covenant between God and his people, God put the old plan on the shelf, and there it stays gathering dust. Well, that says it pretty plain. Now, why this? This is kind of rough language, you know. I mean, this is kind of, he's speaking kind of bluntly, I guess you could say. Why is he so focused on this? Well, the main issue is what Jesus brought up at the Last Supper when he said, I'm making a new covenant and it's in my blood. I'm going to shed my blood for the discharge penalty from sins. That's the big change. Now, that's why this writer is straining so fiercely to try to get this across, because he wants to change our thinking, not our thinking necessarily, but change the thinking of anyone reading this with this in mind. There's already been a sacrifice that has been made, that once for all forever is what he says in chapter 10, that has had the effect of putting sin away. In fact, that's what he says. He uses those exact words. Torrin, let's just skip a little, if you don't mind skipping. I would be reluctant to do this if I was making you flip pages in the Bible. Let's see, what was his name? April, what was the guy's name? Goodman. Remember the carpenter guy used to... What was his first name? Oh, anyway, he was sitting back... Huh? Oh, no, Rod. Yeah. So, Rod, if you're watching this, we're talking about you. No, he was good guy, and he, when he lived here in Alva, he came to church here. But anyway, I had this habit. This was before we didn't always have this thing up here, where it conveniently put it on the screen. And I was saying, well, hold your finger here and turn to this, and hold your finger here. And Rod just spoke and said, I don't got any more fingers. So if I was making you hold your finger there, I'd be reluctant. But here we can just jump around. So did I say what verse? Hebrews 9:26. Torrin, let's just skip for a second. I want you to see, because this writer is he's teaching in an interesting kind of way. They call it a spiral method of teaching. He introduces an idea, then he talks about it a little bit, then he comes back to it again, and then he talks about something else, then he comes back to it again. So it keeps coming back and coming back and coming back, and here it comes back again. He says, for then must, well, get the context. Back up verse 24, Torin. Thank you, Torin. So here's the thought. For Christ has not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are figures of the true, but into heaven itself. Heaven itself. Jesus has entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. He's not a high priest going into some physical temple. He's gone into heaven itself, he says, and he appears in the presence of God on our behalf, for us. You might say, as our representative. Nor yet that he should offer himself often, as the high priest entered into the holy place every year with the blood of others. In the Old Testament, the high priest once a year went into the holy place with the blood of the animal, sprinkled it on the altar. On the Day of Atonement, he said he doesn't have to do that every year. He doesn't have to do that again and again. Verse 26, for then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world. In other words, if that's how it was, if it was like in the Old Testament, he would have had to do it over and over again, over and over again. Go through that whole thing over and over again. He would have suffered often since the foundation of the world. But that's not the way it is. After the colon, he says, but now once. I circled that in my Bible just around. Once, one time. Once did it forever. Once in the end of the world hath he appeared to do what? To put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. The reason I think the writer is being so blunt about don't let your mind be affected by the old. You see, in the old system of things, and he's going to bring this up in a later chapter, you have to keep making an offering for sins. Don't think that way anymore. Christians still think that way. Many Christians think, I'd like to change your thinking. If I commit a sin, I've got to do something to erase it, or to deal with it, or to nullify it, or to get forgiveness for it. Sin, forgiveness. Sin, forgiveness. Sin, forgiveness. He says it's not like that anymore. That's the old garment. That's the old way of looking at it. He says, here's how you should look at it. Jesus appeared once, and he, by the sacrifice of himself, has put away sin. In other words, it's not sin, sacrifice, offering, whatever, however you want to look at it. Sin, forgiveness, sin, forgiveness. One time, Jesus appeared, and he put it away forever. That's why he said at the Last Supper, I'm going to shed my blood for the discharge from the penalty from sins. That's what remission of sins means. When he shed his blood on the cross, the result was the discharge from the penalty from sins. That means all of us who are... See, here's an interesting question. If he made the covenant between him and God, this new agreement, it's for our benefit. How do we fit into it? Well, symbolically, he gave the cup to the disciple and said, here, you drink it. They could have said, I'm not drinking that. We participate by agreeing, by accepting, by placing our faith in Jesus as our representative. Then we become a part of what he's already done. Now, having become a part, we enter into a salvation that is made secure and fixed and permanent, with permanent remission of sins forever, not by something we do, but by something he did. Now, back up just for a minute. I just want to highlight. See, in this chapter 8 of Hebrews, Torin, if you give me chapter 8, verse 6, I'm just going to read through. I won't dwell on this. I think I've made the point. I think you got the main point. I just want to hit a couple of the highlights of what this writer brings to the surface, or brings to the forefront, about what's new about this new covenant. Because here's what I think. This new covenant has been enforced for 2,000 years. Yet, I think in the church world at large, the reality of it is kind of muddled. It's kind of the beauty and the power and the majesty of it and the permanence of it and the security of it and the awesomeness of it, if I can use that expression, the bigness of it, is kind of muddled by confused thinking. And I just want to bring a couple of points to your attention that he brings up here. This is Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6. It says, "But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much more he is the mediator of a better covenant, which is established upon better promises." Now notice, the reason it's better, the reason it's a better covenant is because he's the mediator of it. The reason it's established on better promises is because he's the guarantor. In other words, it's not a covenant between you and God, it's a covenant between Jesus and God. And we enter in by trusting in him as our representative, a mediator. A mediator is somebody who stands between two parties. Isn't that right? If there's a conflict between this party A and party B, well, the mediator stands between and he makes peace between them. He mediates. He smooths over the differences. He erases the differences. He brings it back together again. Jesus is the mediator of a better covenant. We've got a mediator on our behalf. You notice we read a minute ago, he stands in heaven in the very presence of God on our behalf. That's why your eternal situation with God, that's why your status with God is secure, because it's not resting on you and your performances. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with people who become fearful that, especially when they sense that their own personal death is imminent. I don't think I've done enough good things, Well, you see, you've forgotten about the mediator. If it was about you doing enough good things, you wouldn't need a mediator. Do you ever think about that? I'm just letting you ponder that for a minute. If it was about you doing enough good things to merit going to heaven, you wouldn't need Jesus at all. There wouldn't be Jesus. If God thought that was a good idea, Jesus would have just stayed in heaven. But he sent him on purpose. He appeared to shed his blood by the sacrifice of himself to put away sin, to make it secure. That's what the mediator does. But he's just getting started here. Look at what he says in verse 7. "For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second." In other words, if that first one got the job done, you see what's the basis of the Old Covenant? Well, the basis is commandments. Commandments and then promises. The most clear place to see it, and we're not going to turn and read this, I'm going to save a little time, I'll just refer to it. In Deuteronomy 28, there are promises in the first 14 verses. Promises for the keeping of everything that's written in this book. That's what the demand is. If you listen diligently to observe, to do everything that is written in this book, he doesn't say do your best. He doesn't say 90%, or he doesn't say, well, do what you can. He says you must observe to do everything written in this book, then these promises are for you. And then he says if you don't do everything, if you fail to do everything written in this book of the law, then all these curses will come upon you. And there's about 14 verses that contain the blessings and about 30 or 40 verses of curses. There's like 10 times as many curses. Now, in case you think I'm not applying that right, you can read the 3rd chapter of Galatians, and Paul refers directly to that, and he says, anyone who tries to approach God under that system is going to automatically be under the curse, for it should be obvious that nobody has observed to do everything that is written in this book. That's why he goes on to say, the verse that we're familiar with, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. Because if it was up to us doing enough good things to merit God's favor, we are all under the curse. Because we're not perfect. But guess what? We have a perfect mediator. I'm not perfect, but I've got a perfect Savior. You're not perfect, but you've got a perfect Savior. You haven't done enough good things, but He has. It's not about you and what you do for God. It's about Jesus and what He's already done. So, he says, if that first covenant had been faultless, the first covenant rested upon the human participants, the nation of Israel. Hear, O Israel, it says. Observe to do all these things. Well, that was its weakness. If that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. You know why he's saying all this? He's writing to Hebrews. He's writing to Jewish Christians who are under tremendous pressure to abandon Jesus and Christianity and go back to the temple and begin offering animal sacrifices. You see this clearly in chapter 12, where he's exhorting them. He says, just remember the former times, when everybody excluded you, when everybody... See, if you embrace Jesus in a Jewish household, especially in the first century, it may be this way today, I don't know, but I hope it's not this way, they would hold a funeral for you. They would exclude you. You were excluded from your family, you were excluded from your social circle, you were excluded from the temple, you were excluded from everything you knew. So he's saying, if that first covenant had been faultless, they were under tremendous pressure, is what I'm saying. So he's exhorting them. He's trying to say, look, don't be tempted to go back because this is so much better. Verse 8 says, for finding fault with them, he says, now he's going to quote from Jeremiah. It's in chapter 31. We're going to read it. He's quoting from it here. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. Well, we just read where Jesus initiated or inaugurated it in his own blood. But he predicted it in Jeremiah 31. I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah. Look at verse 9. Not according to the covenant I made with their fathers in that day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. Now, first of all, he says, it's not according to that. You know what not according means? Not based on that. It does not agree with that. It doesn't hook up with that. Not according. Not the same. Not according to that covenant that I made with them after I brought them out of the land of Egypt. And it says, because they continued not. It failed because of the human side. God upheld his side, but the human side failed. But this is why the new covenant is so much better. It's not based on us upholding anything. It's based on Jesus as the human representative upholding everything. That's why he's the mediator. So he's saying, it's not like that one. This is so much greater. Verse 10. First point is, we've got a mediator. Second point is in verse 10. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and they shall be to me a God, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. The second reason, the second thing that's new about the new covenant is it's internal, not external. It's not a law carved in tables of stone that's outside of you that you try to look at and live up to. It's on the inside of you, a new nature. We just sang this song earlier today, I'm a new creation. That comes from 2 Corinthians 5:17, of course. If any man be in Christ, he's a new creation. This new covenant produces for us a new creation. Everything's new. And what's new about it is he puts his nature on the inside of us, so that it's not something outside of you that you strain and struggle and try to live up to. It's something on the inside of you as a new heart, a new nature that exerts pressure from the inside, that motivates you from the inside to want to do what's right. And that's part of the growth in the Christian life, is learning to listen to what our conscience says, learning to listen to what is on the inside, because that's where he's made a change. Not out here, but in here. That's radical and different. This is the covenant I will make. I will write my laws in their mind and in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. Verse 11 says, and they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. In other words, you don't have to say you need to know God. He says, they'll all know me, from the least to the greatest. Even if you think you're the least, he says, I'm going to get to know you personally. I know you personally. In other words, we'll have a personal relationship, an intimate personal knowledge of one another. They all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. Verse 12 begins with the word for. The word for means because. Why can we have this intimate, personal, one-on-one relationship with God? Because I will be merciful to their unrighteousness. That means your personal failure to live up to any kind of a righteous standard, whatever it may be, is not going to disqualify you. I will be merciful to their unrighteousness. And, that's pretty good right there. But then he says, and there's more. Their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. He says, your failures, your transgressions, your sins, anything that you think would disqualify you, he won't remember it anymore. In other words, he won't take stock of it. He won't keep track of it. Why is that? Well, we read it in Hebrews 9:26, because Jesus put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. That means it's not on the table anymore. That means it's not a factor anymore. It doesn't mean that he overlooked it. It means it's paid for. It's fulfilled. Jesus in his blood so paid for it that God, sometimes, I think people think that God's up in heaven with a big long scroll and he's writing down everything wrong everybody ever did. Well, if there was such a thing as that, when Jesus shed his blood on the cross, God took out a big rubber stamper that says paid and marked paid on it and then folded it up and put it away. So it's gone. It's not a factor anymore. That's why, you see that, again, this verse begins with the word for. Because he is merciful to our failures, our unrighteousness. And because he does not remember sins and iniquities, he's not taking stock of them anymore. Because of that, what he said in the previous verse, they will all know me. In other words, we'll have a personal relationship. You don't have to go to brother so-and-so and say, well, go ask God for me. Can I just tell you something? This might shock you. There's nobody that knows God any better than you do. Don't think if you can go find some more spiritual person, they're going to go to God on your behalf. God knows you. See, he says, they will all know me. In other words, I'm going to have the same relationship with everybody, the least to the greatest. He puts that responsibility on himself. There's nobody that knows God any better than you. You might not believe that. You might think otherwise, but he says here, they'll all know me. They'll all know me. He will listen to your prayers just as readily as he'll listen to whoever the most spiritual person you can think of. I used to say Billy Graham, but he's gone to be with the Lord. So who else is like that? We always take some human person and exalt them to some high pedestal. Don't think that way. God will hear your prayers just as fast and readily and with as much favor as anybody else, for they will all know me. Why? Because sin is not a factor anymore. And that's a radical thing, and sadly it's still a kind of a new thing. And that's when God did a new thing. That's when God turned the calendar page. Do you know that Paul says that when Jesus came and went to the cross and accomplished what he accomplished, he said that was the culmination of the ages. He called it that. The bringing together, the culmination of all time. And so for us, it means that we, in our relationship with God, have his favor, and we have a secure standing, and he's on our side. And Jesus is the guarantor of that, appearing in the very presence of God on our behalf. Okay, I think that's all we got.